Floyd Mayweather Jr. stepped into the ring as the embodiment of cold perfection in modern boxing history, a man who ended his career with a record of 50-0, undefeated in a sport built on failure and paying the price. He won world championships in 5 different weight classes, unified the prestigious belts of the WBC, WBA, and IBF, and became an icon of an almost impenetrable defensive art. He was the highest-earning fighter in history, the man who turned every fight into a global event, from Las Vegas to London, from packed arenas to television deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Floyd was inducted into the Hall of Fame, recognized by experts as one of the greatest technical fighters of all time, the man who redefined how to win. In boxing, no recklessness, no bloodshed, just precision, discipline, and absolute control. Those titles, those records, those seemingly unbreakable numbers built the image of a perfect champion, an emotionless winning machine without cracks, without weaknesses, a man the world believed had never feared anyone. But behind that glorious picture lies a much darker truth, where every victory simultaneously locked Floyd deeper inside the mental armor he had worn for 30 years. He lived 2 parallel lives. One, Floyd undefeated, proud, celebrated under blinding lights, and another Floyd, quiet, always on defense, never allowing anyone close enough to touch the wounds that never healed. The same willpower that kept him standing against every opponent was the same willpower that forced him to control every emotion, every relationship, every moment of weakness. Because in Floyd's world, letting go meant getting hurt. He learned to win without showing pain, learned to smile for the crowds, while inside carried a long-lasting loneliness, where being undefeated brought no peace, only survival. And it is there, between absolute glory and unseen loneliness, that Floyd Mayweather Jr. existed as a living paradox, a man who conquered the entire world, yet spent his whole life fighting to keep himself from falling apart. If you want to continue following the journey behind the spotlight of Floyd Mayweather Jr., where victories are no longer the only answer, please hit subscribe so we can dive deeper into this story together. Thank you for staying with us. And in the next part, we'll start from where it all began, a childhood that never allowed him to feel safe. Before the world knew Floyd Mayweather Jr. as an undefeated icon, before the bright lights of Las Vegas called his name, there was a child growing up in constant fear in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a place where violence wasn't an incident, but the daily rhythm of life. There, gunshots didn't startle people, drugs weren't hidden, and fights happened as a familiar part of the streets. Grand Rapids, in Floyd's early years, didn't teach kids how to dream. It taught them how to survive. Nightfall didn't bring peace. It brought alertness. The house door didn't close to protect. It closed to temporarily shield against a world always ready to invade. In that house, Floyd never learned what safety felt like. His father, Floyd Mayweather Sr., was a talented fighter, but an addict, often absent, and eventually went to prison. For a child, the image of a father wasn't a source of support. It was an unstable void. When his father was handcuffed and taken away, it wasn't just family separation. It was the moment Floyd understood that adults could disappear at any time. His mother tried to hold everything together, but poverty and insecurity meant the house never truly became a sanctuary. There, Floyd slept with one ear, always listening for sounds outside, learned to read people's eyes before speaking, learned to sense danger before it arrived. Floyd's childhood had no concept of carefree. While other kids dreamed of the future, Floyd dreamed of making it through tomorrow without something bad happening. He learned vigilance before trust, learned to close himself off before opening up. On the streets of Grand Rapids, weakness wasn't forgiven, and a child too soft would be swallowed whole. Floyd watched people he knew disappear because of drugs, because of violence, because of mistakes no one got a chance to fix. Those images sank deep into his mind, planting a quiet, simmering fear. If he didn't protect himself, he would be next. It was in that context that boxing appeared not as a romantic dream, but as a survival reflex. The gym wasn't where Floyd found joy. It was the only place with order. There, rules were clear, the strong survived, the weak were eliminated, and everything happened in plain sight, without the ambiguity of the streets. Those first punches didn't carry championship ambitions. They carried the fear of being hit first. Floyd learned boxing not to become a champion, but to avoid becoming a victim. Every slip, every step back, every defensive reflex came from the instinct of a child who had lived in constant insecurity. In the gym, Floyd found what his home never gave him: the feeling of control. There, he knew when danger was coming, knew what to do to avoid it. Boxing taught Floyd that with enough discipline and focus, he could keep anyone from touching him. And that lesson sank deeper into his mind than any other teaching. He didn't learn to attack first. He learned to last longer. He didn't learn to knock opponents out. He learned to not get hit. In Floyd's world, survival always mattered more than victory. That childhood ended without a clear line between child and adult. Floyd stepped into life carrying a burden no child should bear: the burden of being responsible for his own safety. He grew up faster than his age, colder than necessary, and cautious to the point that he wouldn't allow himself to believe the world could be gentle. From that moment, boxing was no longer a sport. It became the only language Floyd understood, the only way he knew how to exist in a world that had taught him safety wasn't a right. It was something to be taken at any cost. And from that foundation of fear, a person began to take shape, not to dream, but to defend for the rest of his life. If the childhood in Grand Rapids taught Floyd Mayweather Jr. that the outside world was always dangerous, then the Mayweather family taught him an even more complicated lesson: that love could come with fear, and protection could sometimes be given in ways that hurt. His father, Floyd Mayweather Sr., and his uncle Roger Mayweather were the ones who pulled Floyd out of the streets, out of the spiral of drugs and violence that could have swallowed any child. But they also, in their own way, planted a different, more subtle, longer-lasting insecurity in Floyd. In that family, boxing wasn't just a sport. It was the only language of survival, the only measure of a person's worth. The gym became the center of life, a place where everything was organized, orderly, rule-bound, but completely devoid of gentleness. There, no one asked Floyd if he was tired, if he was scared, if he wanted to stop. There was only one question, hanging in the heavy air smelling of sweat and blood: are you tough enough to keep going? Floyd's father and uncle believed they were doing the right thing. In the world they understood, softness was a sin, and love was shown through iron discipline. Every clean punch was praised, every moment of slowness was scolded, and every mistake had to be paid for. Floyd learned to stand still under shouting, learned to hide emotions behind a blank face, because he understood that fighting back or showing weakness would only make things worse. The exhausting training sessions didn't just build his body, they slowly eroded any sense of unconditional love. There, Floyd wasn't loved for being Floyd. He was valued for becoming what the family wanted: a strong fighter, a survival tool, a hope of escaping poverty resting on his still young hands. That contradiction sank deep into Floyd's mind very early. He knew that without his father and uncle, his life might have gone in a much darker direction. But he also clearly felt that the price of that salvation was constant fear. Every time he stepped into the gym, Floyd wasn't just afraid of the imagined opponent in front of him. He was afraid of disappointing the people behind him. Love in the Mayweather family was never given gently. It always came with conditions, with expectations, with anger when those expectations weren't met. And so, Floyd learned to tie his self-worth to achievement, learned to believe that only when he was good enough, strong enough, perfect enough, would he deserve to stay, to be protected, to be loved. In the rare moments outside the gym, Floyd didn't know how to be a child. He wasn't used to hugs, wasn't used to comfort, wasn't used to gentleness that asked for nothing in return. Instead, he was used to scrutinizing eyes, to constant reminders that one moment of carelessness could make everything collapse. The family, which should have been the final refuge, became another space of pressure where Floyd was both protected from the world and forced to be harder than the world itself. He grew up in a bitter paradox. Love was the only thing keeping him alive, yet it was also the thing that never let him feel safe. It was in that environment that Floyd formed a quiet but unshakable belief. No love is free. Every relationship has conditions. Every acceptance must be earned through relentless effort, and safety only exists when you're strong enough to create it yourself. That lesson followed him his entire life, weaving into the way he fought, the way he lived, the way he faced the world. Floyd didn't learn to trust, because trust meant giving someone the power to hurt him. He learned to control, because control was the only way to never again feel the helplessness of that little boy in the gym full of shouting. And from the Mayweather family, from those harsh training sessions mixed with both salvation and punishment, a person gradually took shape. Strong, disciplined, but always carrying a silent bitterness where love never came without a price. From the harsh training gyms of the Mayweather family, Floyd Mayweather Jr., we didn't step out as a fighter driven by the ambition to conquer, but as a child who had learned early that the most important thing wasn't knocking someone out, it was making sure he himself never got hit. While many fighters learned boxing by charging forward, learning to throw the hardest punches, Floyd learned by stepping back, slipping, sliding away from danger with near-ruthless precision. He wasn't drawn to the image of explosive victories or the knockout moment that made crowds leap to their feet. What Floyd pursued was absolute safety, the feeling of controlling every smallest distance between himself and his opponent, the act of leaving the ring without adding a single new wound, whether on his body or in his mind. Hit and don't get hit didn't just become Floyd's boxing philosophy, it gradually turned into his philosophy of life. It was a way of seeing the world shaped by a very old fear. If you let someone touch you, even for a single moment, the price you might pay could be pain, loss, or complete collapse. In the ring, Floyd moved as though an invisible threat was always lurking, and every slip wasn't just a physical reflex, it was a quiet affirmation that he was still in control. He didn't take risks, because risk meant handing power to the opponent. He didn't open up, because for him, victory was never about emotion, it was about survival. That style caused Floyd to be misunderstood early on. People called him cold, calculating, even cowardly for refusing to engage in bloody exchanges. But they didn't see the child who had lived in prolonged insecurity, who had learned to survive by always anticipating danger and retreating at the right moment. For Floyd, boxing wasn't a stage to show courage. It was the only place where he felt the world operated under predictable rules. There were no sudden betrayals, no random anger, no chaos like in real life. There were only distance, timing, and reflexes, things he could control with iron discipline. As he matured, Floyd turned the art of evasion into a complete system. He studied opponents not to find ways to attack them, but to know when to avoid, when to shut down every possible approach. Every fight became a math problem about safety, where Floyd set himself one clear goal: leave the ring unharmed. He didn't need the crowd's applause, because cheering didn't help him sleep at night. What he needed was the certainty that he hadn't let anyone breach his defense, that he remained intact, both physically and mentally. Gradually, the way Floyd boxed came to mirror the way he lived. He didn't fully trust anyone, because trust meant lowering his guard. He didn't open up, because opening up meant letting someone into his most vulnerable space. And he didn't take risks, because his whole life had taught him that a single moment of lost control could make everything collapse. Relationships, emotions, opportunities for deep connection, he kept them all at a safe distance, just like the way he kept opponents out of reach in the ring. Floyd lived in a constant state of defense, not out of arrogance, but because it was the only way he knew to avoid ever being hurt again. Floyd's art of evasion wasn't running away. It was a form of survival sharpened to perfection. It was the response of a once wounded child to a world he believed would never be completely safe. Every step back, every smooth slip carried the memory of days when he had to protect himself from violence, from instability, from emotions that weren't allowed to exist. Boxing gave Floyd a language to say that he was still okay, that he was still in control of everything, even when inside there was a long-lasting loneliness. And in that coldness, Floyd gradually became a living paradox, a fighter who dominated by avoiding, a champion built not on destruction, but on a fear he was never allowed to show. His boxing wasn't just technique, it was the trace of a childhood that was never safe. Proof that sometimes the strongest way to survive isn't to attack, but to learn how to make sure no one ever touches you. When Floyd Mayweather Jr. stepped out of those stifling gyms and into the Olympic arena, the world began to see a rare talent, while Floyd saw another door opening, not a door to dreams, but a door to greater, brighter, more dangerous pressure. The Olympics weren't just a stage of honor. They were the moment Floyd understood he had been placed on a launch pad, where every eye was watching, where every move could be judged, where there was no room for mistakes. Success came early, recognition came fast, and at the same time, a quiet unease began to grow inside him. If everything could arrive this quickly, it could also disappear just as quickly. Entering professional boxing, Floyd didn't take long to understand the new rules. Money, fame, lights, big contracts, they all rushed in like a flood, intense and overwhelming. The early fights brought wins, the wins brought attention, and the attention brought a world Floyd had never trusted. He stood in luxurious meeting rooms, at noisy parties, amid a barrage of praise, but inside he felt the familiar sensation of a child who had lived in insecurity. The more people surrounded him, the harder it was to know who was truly safe. Money didn't make Floyd feel more secure. It just gave him more tools to build new layers of protection. Fame arrived with the same bitter paradox. The public saw a confident, cold young fighter who seemed fearless. But inside Floyd was an endless chain of unanswered questions. Every time he was cheered, he thought about the day everything might turn its back. Every round of applause reminded him that a single moment of lost control could bring it all down. Floyd didn't enjoy success the way others imagined. He didn't relax, didn't allow himself to get drunk on victory. Instead, he tightened his discipline even more, controlling his training schedule, his lifestyle, every tiny detail of his life, as if letting go for even a second would let the chaotic past flood back in. The more famous he became, the more Floyd feared losing control. New relationships appeared quickly, but he always kept them at a safe distance. He learned to smile for the crowds while inside. His internal alarm system stayed fully lit. Who was there for the person he was? Who was there for the money? Who was there for the spotlight? Those questions were never fully answered, and so Floyd chose not to answer them with trust, but with caution. He didn't give anyone the power to hurt him, because his whole life had taught him that when you hand over that power, you could lose everything. The more he won, the less Floyd trusted anyone. Winning didn't bring a sense of safety. It only confirmed that the path he was on was the right one for survival. Every victory reinforced the belief that defense was the only choice. He watched other fighters take risks to please the crowd, to chase fleeting moments of glory, and he refused that path. For Floyd, risk was never romantic. Risk was something that could destroy everything he had tried to build from fear. So he won by never giving anyone a chance, and that very fact made him more and more isolated even in the middle of crowds. The brighter the stage lights, the deeper the darkness inside Floyd. Success didn't erase the memories of unsafe nights, didn't erase the lesson that the world is a place where you must always stay alert. It only covered that fear with a thicker, brighter layer of glamour, making it harder for outsiders to see, but never making it disappear. Floyd lived in two parallel states, a champion being celebrated, and a man always mentally preparing for the day everything might turn against him. He didn't allow himself to believe that winning would protect him forever, because he had seen too many things collapse after just one moment. In the early years of his professional career, Floyd learned how to survive amid money and pressure, amid fame and fear. He understood that success wasn't a destination, it was a fragile state that needed constant protection. Every step forward came with a step backward in trust. Every new milestone made him build another wall. The world called it the confidence of a champion, but in reality, it was insecurity forged into discipline. And so, looking back, Floyd's early success wasn't a fairy tale about a talent being unleashed. It was the story of a young man thrown into the spotlight too soon, carrying a soul that had never truly been safe. Money, fame, and glory didn't heal the fear, they only helped him hide it better. Floyd Mayweather Jr. kept moving forward, winning fight after fight, but each victory quietly etched a deeper truth. In his world, safety didn't come from being loved. It came from never losing control. As Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s career moved into the phase where every eye followed his every step, he began to make a quiet but absolute decision to abandon emotion in the ring. Not because he had no emotions, but because he understood too clearly the price of letting emotions lead the way. Floyd had seen enough stories of fighters swept up in the roar of the crowd, pushed into reckless moments just to please the audience, only to lose everything in a single impulsive second. He refused to let that happen to himself. From very early on, Floyd decided that the ring was not a place to express his ego. It was a place to execute a plan so cold it bordered on ruthless. He didn't fight to excite the crowd. He didn't need applause for intense exchanges of blows. He didn't chase the fleeting glory of a knockout that would make the entire arena explode. For Floyd, all of those things carried an unacceptable risk. The risk of getting hit, the risk of losing control, the risk of letting someone touch him. Instead, he chose the path that annoyed the most people, winning in a dry, precise, emotionless way, leaving no room at all for chance. Every fight was approached like a math problem, where emotion was the most dangerous variable that had to be eliminated. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years lived in insecurity, of understanding that just one small mistake could make everything collapse. Floyd trained his body to the point of near mechanical perfection, but at the same time, he trained his mind to remain unshaken by any external factor. In the ring, he was no longer the frightened boy, nor the eager young fighter trying to prove himself. He became something else. Cold, absolutely focused, operating on discipline and calculation. Every jab, every movement, every defensive maneuver was executed not out of inspiration, but out of meticulous, almost obsessive preparation. Floyd didn't take risks for glory. For him, glory was never worth as much as safety. He understood that the crowd would come and go, that today's cheers could become tomorrow's criticism, but the consequences of an injury or a loss would stay forever. So he refused to play the role of the daring hero. He refused fights staged for drama through constant exchanges. He chose to control the pace, to draw the opponent into his fight, where every move was anticipated in advance. For Floyd, winning wasn't an explosive moment. It was a prolonged process in which he wore the opponent down with cold precision and patience. That very approach quickly earned him labels. The public called him arrogant, a spoiler of boxing's romance, a fighter who only knew how to avoid instead of confront. Those criticisms grew louder as Floyd kept winning, kept leaving the ring almost untouched. But they didn't see what Floyd was really doing. He wasn't avoiding, he was protecting himself at all costs. Every fight wasn't just a battle with the opponent in front of him. It was also a battle with his own past, with the fear of losing control that had followed him since childhood. Floyd understood that, if he let emotion creep in, everything could slip out of his hands. A punch thrown in anger, a step forward out of pride, a moment of wanting to prove something, all of them were doors opening to danger. So he slammed those doors shut. He learned to keep a blank face, to hide every reaction, making it impossible for opponents to read his thoughts. In the ring, Floyd didn't allow himself to celebrate too much when he gained the upper hand, nor did he show frustration when things got tough. He maintained one single state: control. The way Floyd turned himself into a machine wasn't just a boxing tactic, it was the logical continuation of his entire life. From a child who learned to survive by evading danger, Floyd grew into a man who believed emotion was a luxury weakness. He didn't allow himself to dream in the ring, because dreaming meant taking his eyes off the harsh reality. He didn't allow himself to enjoy victory the way others did, because enjoyment could lead to carelessness, and in Floyd's world, carelessness was unforgivable. The more he won, the tighter he gripped his discipline. He didn't let success soften him. Every fight that ended wasn't a finish line, it was a reminder that there was still so much he could lose. He saw his career as a fragile structure that needed constant reinforcement, and the only way to do that, in his view, was to eliminate every uncontrollable element among which emotion stood at the top of the list. The world looked at Floyd Mayweather Jr. and saw a cold, arrogant champion who didn't care about other people's feelings. But the truth was far more bitter. It was the image of a man who had chosen to protect himself to the point of ruthlessness, because he didn't believe the world would do it for him. He didn't turn himself into a machine because he wanted to dominate. He did it because he feared the feeling of helplessness more than anything else. And it was in that very harshness that Floyd kept winning, kept standing tall, kept maintaining an undefeated record built not just on technique, but on fear, disciplined to the point of no escape. When Floyd Mayweather Jr. had perfected his winning machine in the ring, another parallel life began to take shape more clearly than ever before. That was the life the media saw, the image broadcast over and over on screens, on front pages, in endlessly viral videos. Las Vegas glowed, stacks of cash piled high, luxury cars lined up, endless parties, VIP rooms where Floyd appeared like an uncrowned king. The public looked at it all and believed they were seeing the real Floyd Mayweather Jr., a man living in extravagance, enjoying his victories, confident to the point of arrogance, seemingly tireless, lonely, or afraid. The lights were so bright they drowned out every other question. So bright they made people think that was the rightful reward for being undefeated. But behind those lights was a completely different reality, quieter and far more brutal. When the casinos closed, when the music in the clubs shut off, when the room grew silent, Floyd faced something he feared more than any opponent who ever stepped into the ring: silence. In that silence, thoughts he never allowed to exist began to rise. Memories of an insecure childhood, fears that had been disciplined into place, questions that never found answers. Floyd didn't sleep peacefully. Long nights passed in exhausted wakefulness, where sleep became a luxury he couldn't control. His body could rest, but his mind never stopped. That was why Floyd learned to surround himself with noise, not because he loved the commotion, but because he couldn't stand having to listen to himself. Loud music, flashing lights, shallow conversations, laughter that never reached any depth. All of it became another layer of armor, just like the gloves and hand wraps in the ring. There, he didn't have to face the emptiness. didn't have to ask himself how he felt, didn't have to admit that beneath the glamorous image was a man who had never truly rested. Floyd wasn't seeking joy in those moments, he was seeking distraction, a way to postpone the conversation with himself. The two lives gradually drifted apart, no longer touching. One Floyd appeared in public, surrounded by money and power, always in control, always leading. And another Floyd, when the door closed, existed in a state of simmering tension, where insecurity never disappeared. It was only temporarily pushed back. He lived in the paradox of fame. The more people surrounded him, the more alone he felt. Relationships came fast and went fast. Praise left no trace, and trust became the most unaffordable luxury he didn't dare buy, even though he had enough money to buy everything else. The media loved telling the story of Floyd as an icon of indulgence. They captured moments of him throwing cash, lavish trips, sleepless nights in Vegas, and turned them into proof of a limitless life. But they didn't see that those very actions were also signs of escape. Floyd didn't live in luxury because he needed more. He did it because he feared the moment he had to stop. Stopping meant facing emotions that had never been processed, facing the fear of losing control that had followed him since he was a child. This split began to affect the way Floyd saw himself. He was fully aware that his public image was drifting further and further away from the real person inside. But instead of trying to close that gap, he chose to dig it deeper. Floyd built a public persona big enough, loud enough, overwhelming enough so that no one would question what lay behind it. Every time he appeared in front of the media, he played the full role of a man who didn't care about judgment, as if the extravagance was a choice and not a protective shell. And the better he played that role, the harder it became to return to himself. In the rare moments without the lights, Floyd realized he had become a stranger to silence. Silence used to be something boxing gave him in the ring, where every movement could be predicted. But outside the ring, silence became an uncontrollable territory, where emotions could rush in at any moment, so he avoided it. He filled his time with activity, with constant presence, with always having someone around, even if no one could truly reach the deepest part of him. Those two lives existed in parallel, but they no longer intersected. One life was exaggerated, filmed, admired, and criticized. The other life was hidden, where sleepless nights stretched on, where exhaustion built up, where Floyd had to ask himself whether everything he was doing was truly bringing him what he needed. But he didn't allow himself to answer that question, because answering meant having to change, and change meant stepping out of the safety zone he had built with his entire life. That split didn't come from deliberate dishonesty. It came from a defense mechanism that had lasted too long. Floyd didn't intentionally live two lives to deceive the world. He did it to protect himself from a world he had never believed was safe. And over time, those two lives grew so distant that they no longer touched each other. The lights grew brighter, the darkness grew deeper, and in between stood a man who kept walking forward, both wrapped in extravagance and imprisoned in an unseen loneliness. When Floyd Mayweather Jr. reached the absolute peak of the boxing world, it wasn't the explosive moment that victory stories usually tell. There was no sense of salvation. There was no complete joy. Only a thick, heavy silence enveloped everything, the silence of someone who had gone so far that no one stood beside him anymore. Floyd was at the highest place a fighter could reach, undefeated, wealthy, globally famous, in complete control of everything related to his career. But right there, he also realized he had been standing alone for a very long time. In the ring, Floyd no longer had opponents in the usual sense. The big names came and went, none able to penetrate the defensive system he had sharpened his entire life. Each major fight was no longer a challenge. It was a test of patience. He won by rendering opponents helpless, by turning the fight into a space where only he understood the rules. But the more he won, the wider the distance felt between himself and the rest of the world. No one was close enough to understand what he was doing, because very few people had ever had to live their entire life in a constant state of defense like that. At the peak, trust became the ultimate luxury. Floyd didn't trust other fighters, because they came and went with the cycle of fame. He didn't trust the media, because they loved today's winner and were ready to tear you apart tomorrow. He didn't trust the people around him, because money and power made every motive murky. And gradually, he also stopped trusting his own emotions, because emotions had once been something he had to sacrifice in order to survive. The peak didn't bring certainty. It only exposed how fragile every connection was. On the nights before big fights, Floyd no longer felt the nervous anticipation of a fighter awaiting a challenge. Instead, there was an emptiness, as if he were preparing to repeat a ritual that had become all too familiar. He knew he would win not out of blind confidence, but because he had eliminated every element of chance, and that very certainty made victory lose its emotional meaning. When the final bell rang, Floyd raised his hand under blinding lights, but inside was a cold stillness. There was no release, only confirmation that he was still standing, still untouched. Floyd's Peak was a place no one was safe enough to enter. He kept everyone at just the right distance to avoid harm. Relationships, whether professional or personal, were measured by their level of risk. If someone came too close, Floyd stepped back. If someone asked too many questions, he built another wall. This wasn't the arrogance of a winner. It was the ingrained habit of self-defense from someone accustomed to living in insecurity. At the highest point, Floyd wasn't seeking connection. He was seeking safety, and that safety only existed when no one was close enough to hurt him. Success at this level also carried its own unique isolation. Floyd couldn't share the burden of being undefeated with anyone, because no one else carried it. The people around him saw the money, the contracts, the lights, but not the pressure of maintaining a perfect image for so many years. Every fight wasn't just a battle with an opponent. It was a battle with the very concept of failure that Floyd refused to allow to exist. That isolation didn't come from a lack of people around him. It came from no one being able to truly stand in the same position as him. The higher he stood, the clearer Floyd felt that winning didn't bring the sense of safety he once believed it would. It only prolonged the state of defense. He couldn't stop, because stopping meant allowing space to appear, and space was where the old fears would return. So, he kept moving forward, kept fighting, kept filling himself with new goals. But each goal achieved failed to fill the emptiness inside. The peak became a cold place, where no amount of cheering was loud enough to warm the heart of someone too accustomed to protecting himself. In the rare moments when Floyd was alone, no media, no opponents, no noise, he began to realize the most terrifying truth. He had built his entire career to avoid being hurt, and his success had done it too well. It protected him from every punch, but it also blocked every touch. At the peak, Floyd was safer than ever before, but also more alone than ever before. No one was close enough to share the joy. No one was trustworthy enough to lean on. No one was safe enough for him to lower his guard. For Floyd, the peak wasn't a place of freedom. It was a place of isolation, legitimized by victory. The world looked on and saw a champion living in luxury and power. But inside, it was a man standing on a cold mountaintop, where there was no one to hold his hand, where the wind blew harder, and where every step had to be taken with caution to avoid falling. Floyd had achieved everything boxing could offer, but right there, he began to understand that being undefeated didn't mean peace. It was just another state of existence, traded for complete isolation. And when the lights in the ring went out, when the cheers died down, Floyd was left with himself in a place very few people had ever reached. The peak of the boxing world wasn't a warm throne. It was an empty space, where victory no longer made the heart race. and where safety was achieved at the cost of no one being close enough to touch the real person inside him. When the lights of the peak gradually dimmed after each fight, Floyd Mayweather Jr. returned to a private life that victory could not fully shield, where cracks that had existed for a very long time began to show more clearly. If in the ring Floyd controlled every distance, then in his personal life, that distance became an abyss too deep to fill. Romantic relationships came and went at the frantic pace of fame, money, and pressure, but rarely stayed long enough to become a refuge. Floyd loved, but loved in a state of defense. He attached, but always kept an exit ready. He was not used to unconditional closeness, not used to lowering the armor that had saved him his entire life. And so, those relationships gradually fell apart, not because of a lack of emotion, but because of too much unnamed fear. The more famous he became, the more Floyd was placed under the public microscope, and his private life was no longer a private space. Tensions, conflicts, and mistakes that belonged to the personal realm were dragged into the light, exposed before a world accustomed to seeing him as a symbol of absolute control. The domestic violence allegations emerged not as a sudden shock, but as the bursting of pressure that had built up for too long. This was the part of the story that no victory could lighten, no title could erase. Floyd did not step forward to defend himself with flowery words, nor did he try to justify it with achievements or a difficult past. He stayed silent, and in that silence lay a heavy reality. Some mistakes cannot be fully explained by circumstances, yet they also cannot be separated from a lifetime built on defense and fear. The short prison sentence Floyd had to face was not just a legal punishment. It was a rare moment when every outer layer of protection was stripped away. No ring, no lights, no crowd, no music, only cold walls, and time to confront himself. It was not the dramatic collapse the media hoped for, but a heavy stillness, where the undefeated man was forced to stand still and look directly at what he had caused. Floyd did not publicly beg for forgiveness, did not build an easy redemption story. He accepted the consequences in his dry, quiet way, just as he accepted every other challenge in life, by enduring. To understand those mistakes, there is no need to search for excuses, only to look at the psychological foundation formed very early. Floyd grew up in a world where safety was never a given, where love always came with conditions, where power and control were seen as the only way to avoid being hurt. In the ring, that system made him great. But in intimate relationships, that very system became a burden. When loving, Floyd did not know how to feel safe without control. When insecure, he had no other language besides defense. And when defense was pushed to the extreme, it could morph into behaviors that even he struggled to recognize until the consequences had already happened. Those broken relationships left behind not only emotional wreckage, but also further reinforcement of the mistaken belief that no one is truly safe. Each personal failure made Floyd build another wall, tighten the distance from the world even more. He returned to the only thing he trusted: discipline, control, and a schedule that left no gaps. But personal life does not operate by the rules of boxing. There is no perfect strategy for closeness, no absolute defense for emotions. And it was right there that Floyd kept stumbling. The public often viewed these mistakes as proof of downfall, but that view overlooks a far more complex reality. This is not the story of someone deliberately destructive. It is the consequence of a person who never learned how to feel safe while loving. A person who spent his entire life avoiding hurt, controlling everything, refusing to let anyone touch the most fragile part of himself. When relationships demanded trust and vulnerability, Floyd had no suitable tools to respond. And when there are no tools, people often fall back on old reflexes. Reflexes that once saved them, but now cause harm. Those mistakes became indelible stains in Floyd's life story, and he made no attempt to deny them. There were no excuses, no efforts to repaint the image. only a quiet acknowledgement that success does not exempt anyone from responsibility, and past pain does not permit causing more pain to others. Floyd continued living, continued existing between two extremes, a celebrated champion and a man carrying heavy mistakes. There was no full reconciliation between those two parts, only their parallel existence. At this point in the story, the broken personal life was not a turning point that instantly made Floyd someone else. It was a burden he had to carry, like the invisible scars of a lifetime in defense. The mistakes did not turn him into his own enemy, but they also did not allow him to forget. They existed as a harsh reminder that being undefeated in the ring did not mean emotional maturity. And as he moved forward, Floyd carried that painful lesson not as a flag to flaunt redemption, but as a silent weight, shaping how he viewed the world and himself in the years that followed. After the undeniable breakdowns and mistakes, Floyd Mayweather Jr. stepped into a role he had never been taught to take on, being a father. The love for his children came to him quietly, without need for proof, but full of awkwardness. Floyd loved his children the way he knew, the only way he had ever learned in life, protecting them at all costs. But protection does not mean presence. And between those two ideas, a silent gap opened, where helplessness grew with each passing year. Floyd never doubted his love. He could stand before the whole world and say that his children were the most important thing. But when faced with moments that required closeness, a father who listens, unconditional presence, he found himself lacking the language. An unsafe childhood had taught him how to survive, not how to nurture. So, when becoming a father, Floyd carried an emotional legacy of deficiency, a powerful but clumsy instinct to protect, a desire to shield greater than his ability to connect. He used money as a form of compensation. Not because he thought money was everything, but because money was the only thing he believed he could control. Beautiful homes, good schools, the best conditions a father could buy, Floyd gave it all, in the hope that material abundance would keep his children from touching the dark corners he had once walked through. But money could not replace evenings sitting by the bedside, could not replace patient answers to innocent questions, could not replace the sense of safety that comes from knowing there is an adult willing to stay even when things get hard. Deep down, Floyd carried a persistent fear, the fear that his children would repeat his childhood, fear of insecurity, fear of absence, fear of having to protect themselves when still too young. That fear made him control more than necessary, shield more thickly than he should. He wanted to build a world where his children did not have to learn defense early the way he had. But the bitter paradox was that the more he tried to control, the easier it became to miss the simple moments of closeness, the moments a child needs to feel seen and heard. Floyd was not an indifferent father. He showed up in his own way, at big events, in financial decisions, in his readiness to step in when his children got into trouble. But that presence often took the form of action, not listening. When facing his children's complex emotions, Floyd fell back on old reflexes, defense, control, solving problems with resources. He wanted to fix, to clear the path, to eliminate danger. But some sadness cannot be cleared away. It can only be sat with. That helplessness was not loud. It did not explode into major conflicts, but existed as a prolonged, nagging feeling. Floyd watched his children grow and realized that distance did not always come from physical absence. Sometimes distance was created by not knowing how to be with each other's emotions. He saw himself in those moments a child long ago, who once wished someone would understand his fears without turning them into a lesson in discipline. And that awareness made the generational pain clearer than ever. Generational pain is not the exact repetition of violence or poverty. It is more subtle. It lies in the fact that what saved one generation becomes a barrier for the next. Discipline and control helped Floyd survive, but they did not automatically transform into gentleness. He had to relearn from the beginning. while life did not allow rewinding. Being a father, for Floyd, became a late learning journey, learning to slow down, learning not to fix immediately, learning to endure the insecurity of not controlling everything. There were nights Floyd stayed awake not because of lights or music, but because of thoughts about his children. He wondered if he had given enough, if his protection had unintentionally become pressure, if the walls he built to shield them made it harder for his children to reach him. Those questions had no quick answers, and Floyd, accustomed to solving everything with plans and discipline, was forced to accept an uncomfortable reality. Fatherhood has no perfect strategy. In rare moments, Floyd tried to stay with vulnerability. He learned to be silent at the right times, learned to listen without rushing to intervene, learned to let his children walk in a world he could not fully control. Those were small steps, unrecognized, uncelebrated, but they demanded more courage than any fight, because this time he could not rely on familiar defense. He had to open the door, even just a little, to the possibility of being hurt. Being a father in helplessness did not make Floyd weaker. It forced him to face a difficult truth, that love cannot be optimized like a fight, and safety cannot be guaranteed by money or power. Generational pain does not disappear just because there are better conditions. It requires presence, patience, and sometimes the acceptance that you do not have all the answers. And so, at this stage of his life, Floyd continued to live in another paradox. A man who could control the entire ring, yet had to learn day by day how to stay with the uncontrollable emotions of his children. It was a fight with no bell, no audience, no clear victory, only a father trying to break an old cycle, slowly, with silent pain, so that his children would not have to learn to survive in the same harsh way he once did. When Floyd Mayweather Jr. became the richest fighter in history, it was not a moment of liberation. It was the moment when all material limits officially lost their meaning. No more financial goals ahead. No number big enough to create a sense of conquest. Yet Floyd kept moving, kept appearing, kept stepping into the ring in different forms. Money flowed in endlessly, but it could not fill the inner emptiness, because that emptiness had never come from lack. It came from a lifetime of constant bracing, where stopping meant having to face things that had never been resolved. Floyd did not know how to live in stillness. For him, silence was not rest, it was danger. In silence, there were memories of unsafe nights, mistakes not yet redeemed with words, the feeling of isolation for someone who had gone so far from the starting point without a map to return. So he chose to keep creating movement. Money allowed him to do that more easily than anyone else. Every exhibition fight, every public appearance, every new contract became a legitimate reason not to sit still, not to listen to his own breathing in an empty room. The fights no longer carried real competitive meaning, but they carried deep psychological significance. They gave Floyd a familiar structure: schedules, preparation, lights, cheers, the moment of stepping out before the crowd. Those were things he understood, things he controlled. There, he did not have to deal with complex emotions, did not have to answer hard questions. He just had to do what he had done his whole life: stand firm, keep distance, let no one touch him. Money turned those fights into a safe stage, where risks were minimized, but the noise was still loud enough to drown out the emptiness. The exhaustion began to build quietly. Not exhaustion from training or travel, but exhaustion from having to maintain a state of existence with no stopping point. Exhaustion from always having to be the undefeated one, the richest one, the one never allowed to slow down. Floyd had spent his entire life controlling everything, but that very control made him not know how to let go. And when you cannot let go, you can only keep going, even when you no longer know where you are running to. Money once was the tool that protected Floyd from the deprivations of childhood. Later, it became the tool that helped him maintain distance from what he did not want to feel. But money cannot comfort, does not know how to listen, cannot replace the feeling of being at peace in your own body. Floyd could buy everything except the calm that comes from no longer having to prove or run from anything. And the paradox was this: the more money he had, the fewer reasons he had to stop. Outsiders called it greed, but greed usually comes with scarcity. Floyd did not lack. He had excess of everything the world considers success. What he lacked was an inner sense of safety, something that cannot be bought, cannot be contracted, cannot be created by lights or applause. When that feeling is absent, people cling to what is most familiar. For Floyd, that was the ring, the attention, the non-stop rhythm of life. There were brief moments, when everything slowed, that Floyd clearly felt that exhaustion. Not the kind that makes the body collapse, but the kind that makes the mind heavy, where every next movement needs a reason. But instead of stopping, he created more reasons. One more fight, one more appearance, one more paycheck. Not to get richer, but to avoid facing the question: if there is no more boxing, no more money, no more noise, then who is he when he is alone? Money could not save the emptiness, because that emptiness was formed from a lifetime of constant vigilance. It does not disappear when you have enough. It is only pushed back when something big enough covers it. Floyd continued living in that state, not because he did not understand, but because understanding does not mean you can stop right away. Stopping requires learning a completely new skill, the skill of staying still, not defending, not performing, not running. And while the world still saw a man making unimaginable money, inside there was a prolonged exhaustion, where money had become only a means to maintain movement, not out of desire, but out of fear of silence. Not because it was not enough, but because he had never rested. When Floyd Mayweather Jr. truly stopped, no more opponents to prepare for, no more fight schedule to cling to, no more ring to step into, under the lights, a different void opened up, wider, quieter, and more terrifying than any punch he had ever evaded. All his life, Floyd had lived by the logic of defense. If you are always alert, always in control, always busy, then no one can touch you. But when there was no longer a reason to defend, every familiar structure began to dissolve. No more bell, no more referee, no more crowd, only a man left to face himself, with no armor to shield him. Retirement did not bring a sense of freedom. It brought the chill of an empty room after the furniture has been moved out. Floyd realized that many habits that once helped him survive had now become useless. He no longer needed to stay up late to cut weight, no longer needed to train to maintain speed, no longer needed to analyze opponents. But his mind still operated the same way, still searching for threats, still waiting for a danger that no longer existed. The body could rest, but the internal alarm system did not know how to shut off. With no more opponents, Floyd lost an object on which to focus his fear. In the ring, every anxiety had a specific shape, a tactic to counter it. Outside the ring, the worry became vague. It did not stand in front of him to be slipped, did not throw punches to be countered. It lay in mornings without schedules, in evenings without noise, in moments when he did not know what to prepare for next. The final enemy was no longer another fighter. It was the emptiness he had postponed facing for so many years. Floyd began to feel more clearly the things he had once covered with movement. Old memories surfaced without warning. Personal mistakes were no longer hidden by victories. Questions about how he had lived, how he had loved, how he had fathered with shortcomings, were no longer drowned out by applause. He did not collapse, but he could no longer run from it either. This was not a dramatic moment, it was the prolonged sadness of having to stay still with himself. In that stillness, Floyd understood that defense had once been a matter of survival, but now it had become a barrier. There was no longer a reason to keep distance, but the habit of keeping distance had become ingrained. He realized he had grown accustomed to being defined by what he did, not by who he was. When those roles disappeared, the question, "Who am I?" became heavier than ever. Not because there were no answers, but because there were too many answers that had never been allowed to exist. Retirement forced Floyd to relearn skills that boxing never taught: slowing down, staying still, listening. Those were skills without a curriculum, without a coach, without a scorecard. He could no longer win with cold calculation, could no longer evade with quick footwork. Facing himself did not allow slipping punches. It demanded full presence, something Floyd had avoided his entire life. The sadness here was not loud regret. It was the sadness of a late realization that there are fights that cannot be won by defense. Floyd did not lose everything, but he lost something familiar: the certainty of knowing what he had to do tomorrow to survive. When there was no more ring, he had to find another way to live, without relying on constant vigilance. That did not come quickly, did not come easily, and did not come in a straight line. There were days Floyd still sought movement, still needed noise, still needed schedules. But there were also days he stayed longer in silence, even if it was uncomfortable. Not because silence had become pleasant, but because he began to understand that if he did not face it, it would never leave. The final enemy was not the past, not public opinion, not the opponents who once stood before him. The final enemy was the fear of having to live without defense, of having to accept that control is not always possible. For Floyd, retirement was not the end of a career, it was the belated beginning of a confrontation. No audience, no applause, no victory to confirm worth. Only a man standing before his most stripped-down self, learning how to exist without needing to evade. And in that chill, there was a deep sadness. The sadness of realizing that what once saved him was also what forced him to relearn how to live from the beginning. Today, Floyd Mayweather Jr. no longer has to prove anything to the world. No more rankings to climb, no more opponents to defeat, no more records to break. The numbers have closed. The titles are complete. He walks more slowly, chooses to appear less often, and no longer needs victories to confirm his worth. But slowing down does not mean peace. Inside Floyd, the control system still runs, like a machine that has been operating too long to shut off immediately. He understands that he no longer needs to win, but he has not yet learned how to let go. Control was once the language of survival, the thing that kept him standing against violence, poverty, and insecurity. Now, when those threats are no longer clearly present, the habit of control remains quiet but persistent. Floyd chooses schedules, chooses rhythms of life, chooses what is allowed to come close. He accepts slowness, but not uncertainty. He no longer runs, but he still stands in a ready stance. There are days when Floyd can stay still longer than before. No need for lights, no need for cheers, no need to appear to fill the emptiness. He can sit in silence long enough to notice his own breathing, to feel a body no longer pushed to its limits. But peace still comes in short waves, never lingering long. As soon as the silence stretches, old reflexes rise again. The need to organize, the need to master, the need to ensure everything remains within reach. Floyd begins to understand something he never allowed before. Surviving is also a form of victory. Not a beautiful victory, not one applauded, not one with glorious moments. Just still standing after everything he has been through. An unsafe childhood, a high-pressure career, an isolating peak, personal mistakes, the roles he carried for too long. Being here, still breathing, still able to slow down for him, that is an outcome that cannot be taken lightly. It does not erase the shortcomings, but it also does not deny the endurance. Floyd's acceptance is not complete. He does not declare himself healed, does not tell a miraculous transformation story. He only acknowledges that he is learning not to react immediately, learning to let a day pass without any victory, learning to stay with emotions that are not neatly arranged. Those lessons come slowly, sometimes warily, and not always successfully. But they differ from before in one important way. He no longer sees internal failure as something that must be avoided at all costs. There are still moments when Floyd falls back into old control. There are still decisions made out of fear of losing rhythm. There are still walls built when someone gets too close. Half-hearted acceptance is like that step forward, half step back, pause, then step forward again. Not because of lack of will, but because deep change does not happen in a straight line, especially for someone who has lived his entire life in defense. Lowering his guard is an act that requires persistent courage. Floyd today no longer needs applause, but he is not yet ready for complete surrender. He lives in the in-between between movement and stillness, between control and release, between a past that shaped him and a future without clear shape. That in-between is not comfortable, but it is the only place he can stand without playing a role. No longer the champion, and not yet quite a peaceful man. Just a human learning how to live without needing to evade everything. And perhaps, right there, another form of victory exists. Not the victory that silences the entire arena, but a victory small enough that no one needs to witness it. The victory of slowing down, even though it is not yet calm. The victory of acknowledging that existing also requires courage. Floyd Mayweather today is not perfect, not fully healed, but he is still standing. And sometimes, for a life that has had to brace itself for too long, that alone is enough to call a victory. And when the rhythm of life slows long enough for the numbers to no longer obscure the truth, Floyd Mayweather Jr. understands that 50-0 was never a gift. It was the price. A price paid gradually over the years, through every choice, through every time he decided not to allow himself to weaken. The world looks at the record and sees perfection. But behind that perfection is a quiet chain of refusals. Refusal to take risks, refusal to let go, refusal to trust, refusal of fragile moments that could bring people closer together. Undefeated did not come from luck. It came from tightly closing every door through which hurt could enter. In boxing history, people praise champions who dared step into danger to create great moments. Floyd chose a different path, less romantic, but far more brutal. He built his career with cold discipline, by eliminating risk to the maximum, by turning himself into a complete defensive system. That path brought absolute victory, but it also carried a heavy legacy, prolonged isolation. Because to never lose, Floyd had to accept never relaxing. And to never relax, he had to live in a state of tension that very few people saw. 50-0 is hung up as a symbol of glory, but for Floyd, it is a reminder of everything he sacrificed. Sleepless nights, relationships that never reached depth, moments where he chose control over closeness. Being undefeated protected him from punches in the ring, but it also kept him distant from ordinary human experiences. There was no room for weakness, because weakness had once been the door to danger in his childhood. And when someone learns to survive by never allowing weakness, that habit follows them to the end of their life. Floyd's legacy, therefore, is not just defensive technique or financial records. It is a bitter lesson about the price of absolute control. He proved that a person can reach the peak without trading it for public failure. But he also showed that continuous victory does not equal healing. Being undefeated kept him safe, but prolonged safety made him weary. That is the paradox. Only those who have lived too long in defense can understand. The world often asks Floyd why he does not allow himself to weaken, why he does not tell a complete redemption story, why he does not let go of the old image to step into a lighter new chapter. But those questions assume that weakening is an easy choice. For Floyd, it is something foreign. Weakening is not just emotion. It is the memory of unsafe days, the feeling of being exposed before a world that once showed no mercy. To survive, he learned never to allow it, and that lesson, however cruel, has been etched deeper than any title. So, when speaking of legacy, honesty is needed. 50-0 is not a trophy on the shelf. It is a mental structure that shaped Floyd's entire life. It helped him stand firm against every opponent, but it also made it hard for him to lay himself down safely. It created an invulnerable image, but at the same time blurred the fragile person behind it. And it is in that blurring that silent pain exists, not loud, not dramatized, but persistent. Honoring Floyd is not about denying his mistakes, nor is it about sanctifying his undefeated record. Honoring is looking straight at the price and acknowledging that he paid it his entire life. A man who survived by never allowing himself to weaken, that is strength, but it is also burden. Strength, because it carried him through every visible challenge. Burden, because it forced him, very late, to relearn how to live without defense. That painful legacy places Floyd in a rare position in sports history, not just a champion, but proof of a different path, a path where victory is built by refusing hurt, and the price of victory is prolonged loneliness. 50-0 did not grant him peace, but it tells an honest story about human endurance, and perhaps it is that very honesty, unpolished, unsoftened, that is the deepest part of the legacy Floyd Mayweather leaves behind. And then, when all the numbers stood still, when there were no more fights to count down to, Floyd Mayweather Jr. stepped into a phase of life where no title could fully cover the entire man he was. There was no moment of complete healing, no redemptive transformation, no scene of the man setting down every burden and stepping into a completely different life. Only a quiet truth. Floyd Mayweather grew older, carrying all his victories and all the cracks that never healed. Floyd's double life was never a deliberate act of deception. He did not create two people to fool the world. He created two layers of existence to survive. One layer hard enough that no one could break through. One layer loud enough to drown out the sounds inside. And over time, those two layers fused together, until there was no clear boundary between the real person and the person being performed. Floyd did not pretend to be strong. He was forced to be strong, because if he wasn't, he would not have stood tall long before that. Not being fully healed does not mean failure. It only means that life does not always operate according to the logic of a fight. There are wounds that do not disappear, no matter how many times you win. There are voids that are not filled no matter how much you possess. Floyd understood that later than many others, because he spent his entire life avoiding the feeling of weakness, something that once equaled danger. When you have survived that way for too long, learning a new language for emotions becomes incredibly difficult. There is no grand redemption for Floyd, no moment where he stands before the public and says everything is okay, because everything has never been completely okay, and perhaps it never will be. But that does not make his story meaningless. On the contrary, it makes the story more honest. Floyd is not a symbol of perfection, but a symbol of prolonged endurance. A man who went through an unsafe childhood, a high-pressure career, an isolating peak, personal mistakes, and still stands. He grew older, not in blinding glory as before, but in a slower, heavier, more real rhythm of life. The victories are still there, no one can take them away, but they are no longer the center of everything. They become memories both proud and reminding that every victory has a price, and the price Floyd paid was not defeat in the ring, but a lifetime in defense, where closeness always came with risk. The cracks that never healed do not need to be sealed to have meaning. They exist as proof of a journey that was not easy. The crack of a man who never learned how to feel safe while loving. The crack of a father in helplessness. The crack of a man who gained everything except complete peace. Floyd carries those cracks not as an excuse, but as an inseparable part of who he is. Perhaps, from a distance, People will continue to argue about Floyd Mayweather, about his style, his personal life, his controversial choices, but when looked at closely enough, the story is much simpler. It is the story of a man who chose to survive in a world he did not believe was safe, who chose control when there were no other tools, who chose distance when closeness once meant hurt. Those choices do not make him saintly, but they also do not make him worthless. They only make him human. At the end of this road, Floyd does not stand as a liberated winner, but as a man who has gone as far as he could, no longer needing to prove anything, no longer needing to evade everything, but also not yet able to fully let go. He exists in the in-between, where there is no grand redemption, but there is a quiet acceptance that he did what he could with what he was given. And right there, the spirit of this story closes, not with a promise, not with complete resolution, but with an unadorned truth. Some men are saved by love, some by forgiveness. Floyd Mayweather Jr. survived by never letting anyone close enough to hurt him, and that may have been both his greatest strength and his deepest tragedy. That is not a gentle ending, but it is an honest one. And sometimes, honesty is the most human thing a story can leave behind. Looking back at the entire story of Floyd Mayweather Jr., the lingering feeling is not the overwhelmingness of money or the 50-0 record, but a deep and quiet sadness. Sadness not because he failed, but because he was never allowed to fail. From a childhood in Grand Rapids filled with guns, drugs, and insecurity, Floyd learned a cruel lesson. To survive, you cannot be weak. That lesson followed him into the ring, became the philosophy of hit and don't get hit, and made him the undefeated champion. But that same philosophy seeped into his personal life, causing relationships to break, causing him to father in helplessness, using money to shield instead of emotional presence. The story is especially painful because everything that once saved Floyd gradually isolated him. Control kept him from being knocked down, but it also kept no one close enough. The post-retirement exhibition fights were not about greed, but about the fear of silence, a detail that shows clearly the psychological price of being undefeated. And when there was no more ring, the final enemy was not any opponent, but Floyd himself, facing the stripped-down person who had been covered for too long. Yet this is not a story for judgment, but for honoring endurance. Floyd is not fully healed, but he survived. In American society, where success, competition, and never be weak are often celebrated, this story reminds us that victory does not automatically bring peace. The lesson lies here. True strength is not only the ability to stand firm against the world, but also the ability to stop, connect, and allow oneself to be vulnerable. If not, like Floyd, you can win everything, but pay the price with lifelong loneliness. If the story of Floyd Mayweather Jr. made you reflect on the silent price of strength and being undefeated, please hit subscribe to continue joining us on journeys as honest as this one. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video where we will continue exploring the great people behind the spotlight.